Hey guys, Josie from Queen My Pawn here. Today I want to talk about the Giuoco Piano for beginners. The Giuoco Piano is known as the Italian game, and it starts off with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. A common move here is knight f6, but most beginners go wrong when playing this knight f6 move because after knight g5, this is actually a strong attack. And after d5, pawn takes, knight takes pawn. They have this sacrifice where the knight goes to f7, and after the king takes, the queen comes here and forks the king and the knight. The king has to go to e6 or else he's going to lose the knight. And after knight c3, this knight becomes pinned and it's put more pressure on. It's like rubbing salt on an injury. The only way to defend that knight is knight cb4. There's also this one, but this move is stronger than knight ce7, because here you're threatening to do a fork and win the exchange. Now, white would play queen e4, and that defends against this fork. But even though that gives you time to defend the knight with c6, white then kicks the knight away, a3, knight a6, white castles. White is just fine here. Look at this position. Black tries to basically develop. For example, bishop e7, d4, exploiting the fact that the pawn cannot capture. Black tries to break the pin. Pawn takes pawn, and king to e8 to break that pin. But in this position, it's pretty hard to defend because even though you're up a piece, white is up in development, and it's not exactly the best way to play chess. In order to avoid all this, we can go back to the way that the game started. And the safest move in this position would be bishop to c5. Now, if knight g5, the clear and obvious move is for the queen to take the knight. However, you can't do that when the knight goes to f6, the two knights defense, because knight g5, the queen is prevented from taking the knight. So bishop to c5 is the best move, and this is called the Giuoco Piano. And the game is called the Giuoco Piano, known as the quiet game, because the game stemmed from Italy back in the 16th century. This opening is 500 years old. Now the game may continue d3, at which point knight g5 is a threat. But now you can actually develop with knight to f6. If knight g5, you can castle and the threat's gone. But the beginner may make a mistake. So after bishop takes f7, the beginner thinks, oh my gosh, wow, I am going to check the king and win a rook. If the rook takes my bishop, I can take him back. Well, turns out that even though white does win the rook and the pawn, you get the knight and the bishop. And I want you to note something. Let's promote this variation, first of all. Notice this variation compared to when white started over here. Over here, white has two pieces out, so white's doing okay. But now, white has literally nothing. White got rid of his best pieces and is actually behind in development. And all because of that silly move, bishop takes f7. So the game would continue castling, which is what white should have done in the first place. But now this affords black a strong attack after d6, knight c3, bishop to g4. Now notice, f3 is impossible because that would be check. So, of course, f3 cannot be played. The queen moves to safety, but now black can continue the attack. Try to find a way for black to continue the attack, and I'll pause the video. 1, 2, 3. Those 3 seconds are up, meaning I'm going to say the answer now. The answer is knight to d4. And that threatens a fork. The queen and the rook are in danger. So the only way to defend that would be queen to d2. Now, white didn't want to move his queen here in the first place because the bishop was blocked, but now he's forced to move there. And now we can do a strengthening move. First of all, we want to bring this rook out as a possibility. And we want to note another positional question. This is a positional question. What is one strong aspect or part of black's position? Well, I'll give you another 3 seconds to pause the video and think about what the strongest part of black's position is. Did you know that black has the bishop pair? The bishop pair is strong because you can control not only one color but two colors, and that means you could possibly control half of the board with it, or even most of the board, because you can see over here that these two bishops just slice across the king side. If black did not have his light squared bishop, he would only control the dark squares, and that's kind of puny. We can also see that white doesn't have a light squared bishop himself. So black is strong on the light squares. Now it looks like that white can move his queen onto the dark squares to kind of compete. But first of all, we have a bishop that controls the dark squares, and a bishop versus a queen, even though the queen is stronger, the queen can't exactly just move to d1 because the bishop will capture it. And even though the rook will capture it back, black has less control of the light squares, but white's missing a queen for that. So that doesn't make any sense. And second of all, even if white were to gain control of the light squares by moving his queen to, suppose, g5 to try to control the light squares here, which obviously doesn't make sense, but let's just assume. Well, black can always move his queen to the dark squares and control the dark squares even more. So black has a lot of choice, and white's kind of stuck here with the dark squares. Now, we focus on our strengths by moving the queen to d7. And now, white tries to develop his rook to e1. And now, black has a couple of good choices here. A good plan would be rook to f8 and king to g8, allowing the rook to take part in the attack. But white has a strong move here, and it's all based on this fork. You can't do the fork right now because the pawn's in the way, and the pawn would just capture your knight. But if that pawn weren't there, that knight to f3 would do a triple fork. Find a way to make that happen. And I'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video. Did you find the best way to continue? The best move is bishop to h3. If the pawn takes back, the fork happens on knight f3. Now, if white doesn't take this pawn and play something like b3, white's really in trouble now because queen to g4 would be a strong option. And this is actually a common checkmating pattern known as Lolly's mate. So if we go over here to checkmate patterns, this is called the Museum of Checkmates, by the way. And you could see Lolly's mate right here. Just click on that and you can see over here, that is Lolly's mate. Pawn on f6 and the queen on g7. It's kind of the same thing over here. Pawn will be on h6. And the queen comes over here and checkmate. Now, that's the only way to block it, but then the queen just comes over here and checkmates anyway. This would be a good way to defend g2, but then the knight just takes on f3. And that's a triple fork. And actually, you could either take the rook or the queen and checkmate on the next move. I would consider, however, the knight takes rook a faster way to checkmate, because the problem is if you take the queen, the rook can go to g1, and you know it takes. I mean, it's the same thing really. So moving forward, queen to g4. But actually, in the game, the other move played was bishop takes pawn on g2. And now another different checkmating pattern happens. If the king takes the bishop, which is actually what happened in the game, and had to happen because knight to f3 was threatened, forking again. I'll put those in red. Now queen to g4, and now the king is forced to go to h1 or f1. And here comes the second checkmating pattern. After king to h1, we can find that there's a checkmating pattern in the Arabian mate. Now, the Arabian mate is with the knight and the rook, and notice that the queen can do whatever a rook does, so in essence, it can do an Arabian mate. The knight would have to be on f3, and the queen would have to be on h2, and that would be it. That would be a checkmate. So the next move is knight to f3. The queen is under attack, and actually this is a nice fork. So the queen tries to pin the knight, but then the queen just goes to h3, and checkmate is inevitable. Queen takes knight, queen takes queen, king to g1, queen takes f2, king to h1 again, and checkmate. But in the game, this was the continuation. King to f1, but now checkmate is faster. Queen to h3. The king cannot escape here because of the knight. The king is forced onto g1, knight f3. That's actually a nice fork. King to h1, and you can take the queen now, but even stronger is checkmate. And this all happened from the fact that white thought that taking the rook was a good idea, but you got two minor pieces off of that trade, and white gave up all of his pieces. And two minor pieces are more important than a rook in the middle game because the rook needs open lines to fight, and there's no open lines here. The rook is blocked by its own pawn. So that was a terrible trade. But that's how you play the Giuoco Piano for beginners.